The forward operating base was burning with urgency. Dust rose in thick, choking curtains across the airstrip as the operations commander pressed his radio hard against his ear, scanning the small crowd of personnel gathered near the flight line. 3 aircraft were grounded. 1 crew was unaccounted for. A ground unit 20 miles east was requesting immediate close air support coordination, and the window was closing fast. The commander pulled off his headset and shouted above the engine noise, his voice raw and desperate. "Is there any combat pilot on this base right now? Anyone with cockpit hours on a fast jet, speak up immediately." The men in flight suits turned to each other. Captains consulted captains. A young lieutenant shrugged. A logistics officer shook his head slowly. Nobody stepped forward from the cluster of senior personnel standing near the briefing tent. Nobody seemed to notice the woman crouching beside the portside landing gear of the grounded aircraft at the edge of the tarmac. She was wearing a faded olive coverall, her hands wrapped in a cloth stained with hydraulic fluid. She looked like a mechanic. She looked like someone whose job ended when the wrench was put down. But then something caught the light. On the left shoulder of that coverall, almost completely hidden beneath a rolled sleeve, was a patch. Small, worn. A viper in mid-strike, coiled above 2 words that most people on that base had never needed to read before. And when the radio crackled again with a partial transmission, the kind of broken call that only a pilot trained in combat communication would immediately decode, she tilted her head, lips moving silently, reading it with her eyes closed. Because she already knew what it meant. The question the base commander should have asked was not who looked like a pilot. The question should have been, who has already paid the price to become one? Here is the story of a woman who never stopped earning her wings, even when the world stopped looking at her long enough to notice she was still wearing them. She grew up in a flat, windswept town where the land stretched so wide that the sky felt like the only thing worth looking at. Her name was Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, though almost nobody on base knew her full record yet. As a child, she would lie on the hood of her grandfather's truck in the evenings and watch the contrails of military jets dissolve into the darkening sky above the desert. Her grandfather, a retired Army warrant officer, told her those were the marks left by people who had chosen to be extraordinary. She believed him completely. She was 7 years old and already certain that the sky was not something to admire from below. Her father worked the oil fields. Her mother taught school. Neither of them discouraged her dreaming, but neither of them could fully picture it either. When she was 12, she found a battered copy of a memoir written by a military test pilot at the local library. She read it 4 times. She started sketching aircraft instruments in the margins of her homework notebooks. By 14, she had memorized the phonetic alphabet, not because anyone taught her, but because she understood somehow that language had weight in aviation. That precision in speech was the first form of flight discipline. When she told her high school guidance counselor that she intended to become a military aviator, the counselor tilted her glasses and said something that was meant to be encouraging but landed like cold water. She said that it was a difficult field, that the physical demands were extraordinary, that the washout rates were high, and that Elena should perhaps consider something more realistic given her family's resources. She did not say the word gender. She did not need to. Elena walked home that afternoon feeling something harden quietly in her chest. Not anger, not resentment, something more useful than both. She decided that day that she would not argue about whether the path was possible. She would simply walk it until either it opened or it ended. That distinction would be hers to discover. She applied to the military through the enlisted route first, understanding that the path to aviation required a foundation of discipline that no amount of enthusiasm could replace. She scored at the top of her aptitude tests in spatial reasoning and mechanical systems. Her recruiter raised an eyebrow at her scores and told her she had options. She told him she already knew which one she wanted. She wanted aviation. He told her the pipeline was long and brutal and that most people who attempted it did not finish. She thanked him and asked where to sign. That was the first time a man in uniform underestimated her. It would not be the last time, but it would also never be the last time she moved forward anyway. Flight training did not feel like triumph. It felt like controlled drowning. Elena arrived at the training base with a class of 22 candidates, and she was one of 2 women in the group. The other woman washed out in the second week, not from lack of ability, but from an ankle injury sustained during the physical conditioning phase. Elena watched her go and understood then that the pipeline was not designed to be cruel. It was designed to be unforgiving. Forgiveness was a luxury that altitude and speed did not offer. The first weeks were ground school, and Elena was grateful for every single hour of it. Aircraft systems, aerodynamics, weather theory, navigation, emergency procedures. She absorbed it all like someone who had been waiting her entire life for permission to learn these things formally. Her instructors were professional and largely neutral, which was its own kind of relief. They graded her work. They corrected her errors. They did not change the standard because of who she was. That equality of rigor felt more respectful than any accommodation could have. The simulator was where she began to understand herself differently. Simulators are relentless in a way that instructors cannot always be. The machine does not soften a stall. It does not pause a system's failure so that a student can collect herself. On her fourth session, she was given a compound emergency, an engine fire combined with a hydraulic failure on approach in simulated instrument conditions. She overcorrected. She got task-saturated. She crashed the simulated aircraft into the virtual runway and sat in the frozen cockpit with her hands still on the controls, breathing hard, staring at the frozen crash screen. Her instructor said nothing for 15 seconds. Then he said, "Reset. Go again." That was the lesson she took from the simulator that day, and it was not technical. The lesson was that failure was a data point, not a verdict. You reset. You went again. You carried the failure forward as information, and you used it to fly better the next time. She struggled with formation flying. The spatial awareness required to maintain precise position relative to another aircraft at high speed, in 3 dimensions, with communication discipline and fuel awareness all running simultaneously. It was the hardest cognitive task she had ever attempted. She put in extra hours, not because anyone required it, but because she understood that competence was not something that happened to a person. It was something a person built, deliberately, with repetition and humility. The ground crew became her unexpected education. The mechanics, the crew chiefs, the fuel specialists. These were the people who kept the aircraft alive, and she spent her off hours learning from them. Other candidates relaxed. Elena crawled under aircraft and asked questions. She learned what hydraulic fluid felt like before a seal failure. She learned the sound a compressor made when it was beginning to fatigue. This was not required, but it would matter later in ways she could not yet anticipate. She earned her wings on a cold morning in front of a small audience. Her grandfather came. He stood at attention even though he no longer had to, and when she walked past him, he did not hug her or clap loudly. He simply nodded once, the way people nod when words are not sufficient. She nodded back. She understood. Her first operational assignment placed her in a mixed fighter attack squadron at a forward-positioned air base. The unit had a strong record and a proud culture, and she arrived as a fully qualified pilot with solid training numbers and excellent evaluations. What she also arrived with, though invisible at first, was the quiet weight of being new in an environment where belonging had to be earned in ways that were never written in any regulation. The exclusion was not loud. Nobody told her she did not belong. Nobody wrote anything official. It was subtler than that, and in many ways harder to navigate because subtlety leaves no trail to report and no target to confront. When the senior pilots gathered informally after briefings to debrief in the way that experienced aviators do, sharing observations, discussing what worked, refining tactics through conversation, she was not invited. Not explicitly excluded. Simply not included, which amounted to the same thing. Her opinions in mission planning sessions were heard, but seldom engaged with directly. She would make a suggestion about routing, about weather avoidance, about a comm procedure she had used in training that had practical application. The room would continue as though she had not spoken, and then 3 minutes later a male colleague would make a similar point and the conversation would pivot toward it. She logged these moments without bitterness, because she understood something important. Reacting emotionally would have confirmed the narrative some people already held. Excellence required her to be impeccable not only in the cockpit, but in how she managed herself when the cockpit door was closed. She flew her early operational missions without error. Her instrument work was precise. Her communication was textbook. She flew wing position well, maintained formation discipline, and followed the chain of command without complaint. Her flight lead wrote her evaluations in language that was competent but distant, phrases like meets standard and performs assigned tasks adequately, language that was technically positive but reflected no genuine observation of her actual ability. She began to understand that being adequate in an environment where excellence was expected was not the same as being seen. She was not failing, but she was not visible either. And invisibility in a combat aviation unit carries its own operational risk, because the day might come when the team needs to trust someone quickly, and trust that is not built before a crisis cannot be manufactured inside one. She found her allies where she expected least. The crew chiefs, the men and women responsible for her aircraft's readiness, respected her from the beginning because she spoke their language. She knew the aircraft. She had learned it from the ground up, literally, and they recognized that knowledge immediately. When she crouched beside the landing gear and asked the right questions, the crew chief would answer without hesitation. That mutual respect became a foundation. It would become something more later. She also began to build a quiet relationship with the squadron's younger pilots, the ones who were still forming their understanding of what excellence looked like. She flew with them. She debriefed honestly. She pointed out her own errors before she pointed out theirs. Gradually, carefully, she was building something that no evaluation form could measure. She was building credibility. The crisis built slowly, the way serious aviation emergencies usually do. It was not a single dramatic failure, but a convergence, a weather system that moved faster than forecast, a communication relay station that went offline during a critical coordination window, a ground unit that had pushed farther east than their planned position, and two aircraft in the immediate response posture that were both grounded due to unrelated maintenance issues discovered during pre-flight inspection. The third aircraft, the one Elena had been assigned to inspect while the primary crew was briefed, was technically the only fast jet on that base capable of flying. The timeline compressed quickly. The ground unit's forward air controller was transmitting with intermittent signal on a frequency that the operations center was struggling to establish cleanly. The unit needed communication coordination and overhead presence, not weapons, but an aircraft overhead acting as a relay platform. This would help bridge the communication gap between the ground and the base while weather moved in from the northwest and the coordination window narrowed. It was not a weapons problem. It was an aviation problem. It required a pilot who could fly in deteriorating visibility, manage a communication relay function from the cockpit, remain within fuel parameters over a constrained operating area, and coordinate with both the ground unit and the operations center simultaneously. All of this while maintaining situational awareness in weather conditions that would be challenging for any pilot. The operations commander had gone through his list. His primary crews were unavailable. His backup coordination was not resolving. He stood on the edge of the flight line and asked, loudly and without ceremony, whether any combat pilot on base could step up immediately. The men in flight suits looked at each other. Some were support personnel who had never held a cockpit qualification. One was a cargo pilot with no fast jet experience. Nobody with the right qualifications stepped forward. Elena had been listening. She had been crouching beside the portside landing gear of the aircraft she had been inspecting, and she had heard the transmission fragment on the radio clipped to the crew chief's vest, the broken call sign, the partial coordinates, the specific procedural phrase that the forward air controller used, and she had decoded it immediately. Not because she guessed, because she had been trained on exactly that protocol, because she had flown in exactly that type of coordination role during a previous deployment that almost nobody on this base knew about. She stood up. She wiped her hands on the cloth and walked toward the commander. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, "I can fly it. The aircraft is ready. I just finished the pre-flight." The commander looked at her. He looked at the cloth in her hands. He looked at the coverall. And then he looked at her face, and something in her steadiness must have communicated what her appearance did not, because he said, "Who are you?" And she told him her name. And then she told him her qualifications. And then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned her call sign. Viper 1. The crew chief beside her went very still. He knew that call sign. He had heard it years before, at a different base, attached to a different aircraft, and a story he had not thought about in some time. The aircraft launched 11 minutes after the conversation on the flight line, which was not fast by peacetime standards, but was precise and correct by any operational one. Elena did not rush the checklist. Rushing checklists was how aircraft were lost and people died, and she knew this with the certainty of someone who had been trained to know it in her bones. She moved through each item deliberately, communicating with the crew chief on intercom until the aircraft was alive around her, and she was satisfied that every system was functioning within parameters. She contacted the operations center on departure and established the communication protocol clearly before she was airborne. Because clarity before flight was infinitely more valuable than attempts at clarity inside a degrading situation. She confirmed her operating altitude, her fuel state, her planned communication relay frequency, and her abort criteria. The controller acknowledged. She lifted the aircraft off the runway and turned east into a sky that was already showing the gray pressure of incoming weather. The first challenge was the weather itself. The system was moving faster than the updated forecast had suggested, and by the time she reached the operating area, she was working in visibility that required full instrument discipline. She transitioned smoothly, trusting her instruments rather than the instinct to look outside. Because she had trained for exactly this. The discipline to believe what the cockpit told her even when the world outside the glass was confusing and gray. She established contact with the forward air controller on the third attempt, using a backup frequency she had noted from the original transmission fragment. The controller's relief was audible even through the static. She began her relay function, serving as the communication bridge between the ground unit and the operations center, transmitting clearly and concisely, never editorializing. Never adding confusion to a situation that already had enough of it. She repeated information accurately. She flagged discrepancies. She called out a coordinate error in one transmission that, had it been passed uncorrected, would have caused a significant misdirection. Fuel awareness governed every decision she made. She tracked her consumption precisely and communicated her fuel state to the operations center at regular intervals. Because running a relay mission until the aircraft could not safely return was not heroism, it was negligence. When she reached her pre-planned bingo fuel state, she transmitted clearly that she was commencing her recovery. Confirmed that the ground unit's communication with the operations center was now stable through a secondary relay that had come back online, and began her return. The weather on approach was the final test. She flew the instrument approach with full discipline, trusting the procedure, trusting her training, cross-checking her instruments methodically. She broke out of the cloud base at the published minimums and had the runway in sight. She landed firmly and correctly and taxied clear of the runway without drama. When she shut the aircraft down and climbed out, the crew chief was waiting at the bottom of the ladder. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Viper 1, I knew it was you when I saw how you pre-flighted the gear. Nobody checks the aft torque links like that anymore except the people who were trained on the old fleet." She looked at him and said, "The aircraft told me everything I needed to know. That's all I did. I listened to it. That was the whole flight, reduced to its essential truth." She had listened. She had followed her training. She had worked within the chain of command, respected the communication discipline she had been taught, and brought the aircraft and the mission home within parameters. No heroics. No improvisation beyond what the situation genuinely required. Just the application of everything she had spent years learning to do correctly. The debrief was quiet in the way that real debriefs usually are, methodical, honest, and focused not on what went right in a celebratory sense, but on what the data showed and what could be refined. Elena sat at the table and answered questions from the operations commander and two other senior officers who had been called in. She described her fuel management. She described the communication relay process. She described the coordinate error she had caught and corrected. She noted the weather discrepancy between the forecast and actual conditions and recommended that the update chain be reviewed. She spoke without embellishment and without false modesty. She simply reported what had happened. The operations commander looked at her service record, which had been pulled while she was airborne. He read it in silence. He looked up once and then went back to reading. When he finished, he set the folder on the table and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to become significant. Then he said, "Your record should have been part of this unit's briefing from the day you arrived." She said, "Yes, sir." She did not say anything more than that. Because there was nothing more to say that the record did not already say better. Word moved through the squadron in the way that word always moves through small military units, not through official announcement. but through the invisible network of observation and conversation that connects people who work closely together. The crew chiefs talk to the junior pilots. The junior pilots talk to the senior ones. The senior pilots looked at each other with the particular expression of people who had allowed an assumption to sit unchallenged for too long and were now confronting the cost of that. A few of them came to her, not with grand speeches. One simply stopped beside her in the corridor and said he owed her a real debrief conversation and asked when she had time. Another came to her during pre-flight the next morning and asked a specific technical question about weather relay procedures that was entirely genuine, a question asked by one aviator to another, without the careful distance that had characterized their earlier interactions. She answered it straightforwardly and kept moving. This was what she had waited for. Not applause, not apology, just the ordinary professional respect of being consulted as an equal. The call sign reappeared formally in the unit roster within the week because the operations commander ensured it did. Viper 1, beside her name, where it should have been from the beginning. She did not make a point of it. She did not reference it in conversation or display it in any way that invited attention. She simply continued doing what she had always done, preparing her aircraft, studying her procedures, building relationships with the crew who kept the jets alive, flying with the discipline and precision that she understood to be the actual point of all of it. The call sign was not a trophy. It was a designation. It described what she was certified and trained and proven to do. Nothing more and nothing less. There was one evening, near the end of that assignment cycle, when she sat alone at the edge of the flight line and watched the last aircraft of the day recover and roll to a stop. The crew chief walked out to meet it, clipboard in hand, the quiet ritual of post-flight inspection beginning before the engine had finished spooling down. She watched this and felt something that was not pride exactly, but was adjacent to it, the deep and quiet satisfaction of belonging to something larger than herself. Something that required her best and received it. Something that would continue long after her name was moved to the next assignment roster. She had not flown to prove anyone wrong. She had flown because the ground unit needed a bridge and she was qualified to build it. The distinction mattered to her enormously. Elena Vasquez's story is not a story about a woman who overcame the military. It is a story about a woman who understood the military deeply enough to serve it completely, even when it was not yet paying full attention to who she was. She did not arrive at that forward operating base looking for recognition. She arrived doing the work that needed doing, crouching beside landing gear, checking torque links, keeping an aircraft ready in case it was needed. That readiness, quiet, technical, unglamorous, was not separate from her identity as a combat aviator. It was an expression of it. The discipline that made her check every system before she was asked to fly was the same discipline that kept the aircraft inside its parameters when the weather closed in and the fuel gauge became the most important instrument in the cockpit. What her story teaches is not simple. It does not reduce to a single lesson about gender or courage or institutional failure. It contains all of those things, but it is finally a story about what happens when preparation and opportunity find each other, even late, even imperfectly. She was ready because she had chosen to be ready every single day, not for the day she would be celebrated, but for the day she would be needed. Military aviation asks something of every person who enters its discipline. It asks for precision without arrogance, courage without recklessness, confidence without assumption, and the willingness to subordinate the self to the mission and the team and the aircraft and the procedure. It asks these things equally, regardless of who is sitting in the seat. Elena had answered that ask completely. The only thing that had been incomplete was the world around her catching up to that truth. She flew not to prove others wrong. She flew because lives and missions and the integrity of the chain depended on someone doing it correctly when it mattered most. She happened to be that someone. She had simply made certain, over years of relentless preparation, that she would be ready when the moment arrived. The quiet women who serve in the most demanding environments of military aviation do not always get the acknowledgement their records deserve. But the aircraft know. The instruments know. The crew chiefs who watch how a pilot walks to a jet and touches the airframe before climbing in, they know. And on the days when everything depends on what is real rather than what is assumed, the truth of preparation and discipline speaks in a language that cannot be faked and cannot be ignored. Viper 1 is a call sign. but it is also an answer to a question that should never have needed asking.